Given the sheer number of characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's difficult to pin down exactly one main character for this fantasy saga, as so many others have. But I think if I had to pick one, Jon Snow is, I would say, the best candidate. In addition to his literally being the Song of Ice and Fire, being Rhaegar Targaryen the fire, Lyanna Stark the ice, and him being the balancing between the Starks and the Targaryens, these two central families of the story, Jon Snow just has a ton to do in the books generally. Any book he appears in, he has a ton of chapters, other than the first, which is weird because his uncle Ned has so many chapters. And despite being so far removed from all of the other politicking going down south of him, there is just such a key element of the story that is pinned to pretty much exclusively Jon's perspective. That being the struggle against the White Walkers. Jon is a character who is very different between the books and the television show, as people have very correctly noted in certain 2-hour long or 22-hour long videos. And I think that it's very important to examine what has recently happened in Jon's arc in A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons, in order to better examine where he might go in the Winds of Winter, because someday winter is coming. I should start out by talking about A Storm of Swords, because while it is from a long time ago, it's actually older than I am by a couple weeks, but it is very crucial for understanding Jon's arc going forward into A Dance with Dragons. He obviously returns to the Wall in this book after his stint with the Wildlings, and the Battle of Castle Black happens, the Watchers on the Wall, and while that's an excellent episode, I do actually prefer the sequence in the books, as it's days and days of battle. We have multiple chapters of Jon just being pushed to his absolute limit, which anybody who's played in a D&D party I've run for knows that's what I tend to like to do. I also think there's a lot of important politicking that is lost in the show, specifically with Jon becoming the Lord Commander, which happens at the very end of A Storm of Swords. I believe the second to last non-epilogue chapter, other than Sansa. There are a number of other candidates, and there are different rounds of voting, and it actually takes, I think, 3 chapters, a Jon chapter, a Sam chapter, and then another Jon chapter, to get this entire event done. It's very politically complicated, as there are so many different players at the Watch, all of whom are essentially boiled into just Alistair Thorne in the show, which is a shame. Question: who do you want to see next in this series? I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. And if you want to check out the channel, I have a playlist of all of the other Winter is Coming videos where, who knows, maybe the character you want me to cover has already been covered. So be sure to check that out. And yeah, back to Jon Snow's future. You eagle-eared viewers might have noticed me mention A Feast for Crows in that first segment, despite the fact that the point of Feast is, oh, there's no Jon, Tyrion, or Dany in this one. Jon is the exception that proves that rule. While Tyrion and Dany are entirely absent, Jon appears in one Samuel chapter, his first chapter, at the Wall. We see Sam's interactions with his former friend and now the newly made Lord Commander Snow, as this distance is now drawn between them. He's acting very aloof and very cold and focused on his duties rather than his former friendship with Sam. The two still seem to be kind of friends, but we do get Jon forcing Sam to go to Old Town, which he really doesn't do because his abusive father did not permit anyone from their family to become a maester, and he feared his father's wrath given that he lives somewhat near the Citadel. We get Jon's perspective on this chapter in his second in A Dance with Dragons, and it's one of my favorite chapters in the entire book. I've heard people complain about it because it's redundant, but I am just a sucker for seeing events from more than one point of view, and I really think it's fascinating to see Jon's perspective on Sam, and that chapter also goes further with lines like "kill the boy" from Aemon and the execution of Janos Slynt, both of which are just killer developments. His story in A Dance with Dragons opens with both the Lord Commander and the Night's Watch in a very precarious position. Jon has been elected as one of the youngest leaders in this very old organization's history, and he has to deal with the politics of the Seven Kingdoms being brought directly to his door. Stannis Baratheon was able to smash the host of Mance Rayder, but now he is at the Wall. This is one person who is claiming to be the king of the Seven Kingdoms while warring against the individual who is currently sitting on the throne, that being Tommen. A lot of Jon's early chapters in A Dance with Dragons deal with negotiating with Stannis and essentially giving this king the lay of the land of the north and giving him the tools he needs to take on the Boltons. All of these interactions are fascinating. I have a video on Stannis from a long time ago where I assert that he's kind of a Ned surrogate for the audience, and I think that a big part of it, in addition to Stannis' appearance in terms of his timing in the story, is his interactions with Jon. We see Stannis is almost this fatherly figure, and especially given that he's so focused on duty, he is a very very crucial character for Jon at this point in his story, as Jon is now very concerned with living up to the duties of the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. As said previously, we did see him live up to his duties by executing Janos Slynt for being disobedient, and he also starts to do things he really doesn't want to do, like swapping Gilly's baby with Mance's baby, because he's afraid that Melisandre is going to burn this royal baby for its king's blood, as she wanted to do to Edric Storm, or Gendry in the show. Jon's story and dance is mostly focused on the dwindling resources of the Watch and the massive, encroaching wildling conflict that is looming. The armies have been smashed, Mance Rayder has been captured and seemingly burned, but there is still a massive humanitarian issue here, in that all of these people are trapped north of the Wall, and they were definitely going to die to the undead if Jon did not let them through the Wall. Jon is kind of having to court a middle path here, find his own course, and essentially negotiate between the Watch, who really doesn't want to let these people through, most notably Bowen Marsh, who's a character who's barely in the television show, but is a massive part of Jon's arc and dance, and the wildlings such as Tormund and Val. Tormund is absent for a large part of this book, but Val is there and acting as quote-unquote the wildling princess, according to Stannis and the Queen's Men, because they don't really know how wildling kings and queens work, and she's, I believe, Mance's wife's sister. Some people think that Jon and Val are going to be a romantic connection in the future. I think that could be possible, but I don't think Jon's story is going to be focused on romance going forward. I could see something between him and Dany having some thematic significance, but outside of that, I'm really not sure how much is going to be explored. I'd like it to be, though. I like Jon and Val. Bowen Marsh is essentially perched on Jon's shoulder like a parrot for this entire book and just disagreeing with every single decision that the new Lord Commander makes. It sorts out innocently enough, with Bowen Marsh coming off as quite reasonable and just overall trying to think of the good of the Watch and how sustainable things might be, and Jon really doesn't do his best in terms of all elements of being a leader. I think a lot of the choices that Jon makes in this book are the correct ones, but he has a habit of not explaining his thinking and why he's doing things to anyone else around him. You don't really notice it until reread and you realize that this mutiny is coming, which, spoilers, we'll get to in a minute. But Jon thinks about all of these reasons why he's doing each of these things, and he never tells anyone else at the Night's Watch them. So it's kind of sad to watch, because it's what we have here is a failure to communicate is the main thing I'm trying to say, insofar as Bowen Marsh has some good points, but he also has some not good points. Jon also has some good points and some not good points. Their biggest point of disagreement is the wildling specifically, and it does make sense for Bowen specifically, as Bowen is an individual who was very badly injured by the wildlings at the Stony Pass in the previous book, so it makes sense that he'd hold a grudge against them, especially given that he's been at the Watch for so long. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Jon actually has the most chapters in A Dance with Dragons, and this is more to recap than I expected, but the politics of the Seven Kingdoms continue to encroach on him, even despite Stannis leaving, with the arrival of Alys Karstark. Alys is an individual who Melisandre saw coming in the flames, but Jon and Melisandre both thought it was his sister Arya. Alys is escaping a marriage. She ends up getting married to the new Magnar of Thenn, Sigorn, and it's a really nice ceremony, and it's kind of the emotional high point of Jon's story. Additionally, there are other elements of politics at play as well. Melisandre reveals that she did not truly burn Mance Rayder, the king beyond the Wall, and Jon is forced to reckon with, what do I do with this guy who we were supposed to burn? He ends up sending Mance south in order to retrieve Arya from Ramsay Snow, as in the book, Jane Poole is replacing Sansa Stark's story, and it makes a lot more sense than Littlefinger giving Sansa to the Boltons, because he would never do that. It's great. I'm sorry for being angry about that. Jon's final two chapters are his most important in the book, in my view. The first of these sees the wildlings coming through the Wall. Jon and Tormund talk about it and negotiate about it for chapters leading up to it, but to actually see it happen is pretty big, and it feels significant for just the politics of the Seven Kingdoms as a whole. We see that Jon has exacted his quote-unquote blood price, which is essentially enlisting 100 wildling children in the Watch, which will put him in jail for 3,000 years if we're using certain metrics of war crime. crimes, but this does create a lot more tension with his brothers of the Night's Watch. We also hear at this point a letter from Hardhome, where we see that there are dead things in the forest, dead things in the water, and his entire story is capped off with the pink letter and Jon's announcement that he is riding south to face Ramsay Bolton and reclaim his sister and home. This obviously leads to the mutiny at Castle Black, a massive amount of chaos in Jon's 13th chapter that leads to a number of conspirators stabbing him. With that said, I think it's a lot better in the book than the show. That probably goes without saying, but the show is good, but there is a lot more conflict and a lot more actual motivation other than just we hate wildlings behind this. We see that Bowen Marsh is crying as he stabs Jon Snow, as Jon was one of his stewards. He helped Jon join the Watch and train him, and we now see that this mentor is forced to put down the individual who they taught just because they've had a lot of differences, and he's about to abandon his post on the Night's Watch, despite being Lord Commander. So Jon's dead. Jon's not going to be in the Winds of Winter. He's a dead man, so I guess that's the end of the video. Jon is obviously going to be resurrected in the Winds of Winter. I think it's mostly just a question of how and when. I don't think it'll be as immediate as it was in the show. I think he was dead for like 2 episodes, and then he comes back at the end of that second episode. But if I had to guess, he's probably going to remain dead for at least a quarter to a third of the Winds of Winter. It's unclear as to whether or not he's fully dead when he's stabbed. His last word is ghost, and given the precedent of the prologue of Dance with Dragons being Varamir Sixskins dying and then living a second life in his wolf, it seems as though Jon is going to have his soul go into ghost while his body is maybe comatose or maybe just straight up dead. After that, it's unclear how exactly Jon will come back from the dead. We've seen agents of her lore like Melisandre bring people back from the dead, like Beric, but it's unclear if she knows that power is possible. Thoros didn't when he did it for the first time, and there are a number of other ways it could happen. There are a lot of people coming back from the dead because of the White Walkers north of the Wall, so there's a non-zero chance Jon could do that. We also see Cold Hands, who seems to be an agent of the Three-Eyed Raven, or Three-Eyed Crow in the books, excuse me. It's unclear. There are drafts indicating that at one point Martin wanted some element of Bran interfering in this resurrection, or maybe fueling it, but given that that's not in the final book, I do think it's more likely to be a combination of Working Ghost and Melisandre's magic. I think there's another point with Jon's resurrection that is worth discussing. I've seen a good amount of disagreement on it online, and I fall on one side of this issue, but I can very much see both. That being Jon's status as a viewpoint character after his resurrection in the Winds of Winter. The reason people are divided on this is because the one time we've seen this happen before, our one precedent, is Catelyn Stark, who dies at the end of Storm of Swords and is revived as Lady Stoneheart, but of course she does not have any chapters as Lady Stoneheart. I would argue that is a slightly different case. One individual instance does not a precedent make necessarily, though in some cases it certainly does. And I do think that Jon is a much more central character than Catelyn. I think that Catelyn by that point had kind of played her part as she's our view on Robb, and Robb is dead at this point, and having her as a viewpoint would kind of necessarily spoil certain parts of A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, and then later The Winds of Winter. Jon Snow is much more important, though honestly, as an artistic decision, I would really respect it if Martin kept Jon Snow as a non-viewpoint character and just had these outside perspectives on him. I think that'd be really cool and kind of resembling how Robb was as a king. I could see either way. I personally think I'd like it a little bit more if he weren't a viewpoint character, but I also love his chapters, and I think it'd be easier for Martin to write if he were. Plus, being in his head would give us more of a chance to see how he actually changes. I do think that we'll see the North through Melisandre's eyes for the first couple chapters of The Winds of Winter. I'll do a video on her separately, as I'm trying to cover all of the viewpoints in this series, but overall I think that Jon is not coming back into play for a little bit. But I do think he has a crucial role to play in the future. Martin has made a few comments that indicate Jon's path, but overall he's been quite closed-lipped on what is going to happen to Jon. We've had no chapters at the Wall since Dance with Dragons released in 2011, so we're 13 years out from one. We've not had a Melisandre sample chapter or anything close to that, so we have no idea what's going on up there. And additionally, we really haven't heard Martin comment on it a ton, given that he tends to keep certain plots close to the vest. Specifically, he doesn't talk much about the North, he doesn't talk much about what Daenerys is doing, he doesn't talk a ton about Old Town. But there is one significant tidbit that I do think indicates that one event from the show might be done, but slightly better in the books, and that's the Battle of the Bastards. This isn't a sure thing, but at one point at a convention, George R. R. Martin noted that in the future, we're going to see in the books a Stark direwolf going up against Ramsay's hounds. Well, this could be Nymeria and her wolf pack in the Riverlands. It could also be Ghost, and Ghost is a heck of a lot closer to the pack of hounds than Nymeria, as it is likely that Ramsay will not remain at Winterfell for very long, given that Stannis seems to be descending on it. I do think that Stannis will be victorious in the Battle of Ice and will claim Winterfell. I think that if Ramsay is going to meet another foe in the open field, as he is not participating in the Battle of Ice, I think it will be Jon Snow, and it won't be at Winterfell. It might be on his retreat to the Dreadfort, as Jon is still going to want to pursue vengeance for his supposed sister Arya Stark, unless Jane Poole reaches the wall before this would happen. It's also worth noting that Ghost could die in Jon's resurrection, being a blood sacrifice to get his soul out of there and back into his main body. So overall, it could be either way. I could see a number of Stark direwolves fighting the hounds, but I think that would be an interesting interpretation, and it would be cool to see Jon actually defeating this evil bastard, this kind of dark mirror of himself. I do think that Jon is going to leave the Night's Watch at least somewhat. I think he'll still remain involved in the politics therein, and they're obviously going to be a pretty big part of the future book with the conflicts with the White Walkers. And I do think that his mind is going to remain focused on that, but I do think the show had it right with his watch having ended with his supposed death. Jon is a very important political character going forward, especially potentially being Robb's heir or being a legitimate Targaryen, so it's really unclear where he could go. I think he's definitely destined to go to Winterfell, but once he gets there, he could conceivably be crowned king in the north by way of Robb's will. He could conceivably hear of his parentage by way of Howland Reed or, I don't know, Bran magic or something. Probably not that. I hope it's not that. Jon's story is very open-ended because we really don't know much that's going to happen other than him coming back from the dead at some point in the future. I'm going to end this video with what my main hope is for Jon in the Winds of Winter. I was really disappointed with what the show did with Jon for the last 3 seasons. I'm disappointed with the entire show for the last 3 seasons, but they really kind of spiked the football on Jon specifically. Jon is such an interesting character in the books. This savvy 16-year-old who's very politically gifted, who's now been stabbed and is going to come back from the dead. I'm very excited to see how that changes him, as we have seen the individuals who return from death in Martin's book are quite changed. Beric is not the man he once was, and Stoneheart certainly is quite different than Catelyn Stark, though some people would have you believe that Catelyn's been evil this entire time, which she really hasn't. It's been pretty justified, but regardless of that, I'm excited to see where Jon goes and how his story differs from the show, as he is just such a different character. As I mentioned, there are a couple good videos covering exactly those differences and what might end up happening. Jon could even end up claiming a dragon. This could be a logical progression, especially if Ghost ends up dying in a blood sacrifice to return Jon to life. I think that direwolves are kind of viewed as the king of the wolf, so I think that Melisandre could kind of spin that as king's blood, and just the warging magic could work with it. So to get a new pet, Jon could always claim the dragon named after his father, Rhaegal, but Rhaegal would have to get pretty far north, but I mean, they'll have to fight the White Walkers anywhere. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. There will be much more on A Song of Ice and Fire in the near future, and I'd love to hear your comments below if you have any opinions on Jon Snow, this series as a whole, or just A Song of Ice and Fire generally. There are many more characters that I'd like to cover in this series, and there will be a variety of other videos coming out. I like to just kind of pepper these in, as I think they're a fun mix of like recap and analysis that's it's a nice format, and I think they will be useful if and when Winds is ever published, because these are big books, and I could see people needing a recap. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.